Okay, we're going to get caught up on where we are in this project for rewriting the application that we used to have written in Go in Rust so that we can communicate with a REST server and deal with our opening, closing files, reading from the file, and writing the file. So I've modified a little bit of the code with respect to opening and reading the file. The earlier version of the code actually opened the file and read the entire contents into a single string variable. That really wasn't a good solution because as we're looping through the file, there are headers on each line that tell you what it is you're reading. Is this line related to the earlier part number, or is this line a new part number and we need to collect the data on it? Is it the description we're reading? Is it the part number? So there's elements to it that we needed to know as we're reading down through the file. And the earlier process didn't really give us too much in the way of keeping up with that. So just a few things up here at the top. You'll notice here is a little tag. It's a macro, I think, that actually says to allow unused. Well, by default in Rust, as you're defining variables and defining say a file handle or something like that, if you don't use that, then you get a bunch of warnings in your compiler when you go through to compile the program. You get a bunch of warnings that tell you that, hey, you declared this variable, but you haven't actually used it yet. Now, what you could do is to put this in here while you're developing the code, and then comment the thing out when you're done to make sure you didn't forget anything, so you can go back and clean it up. Or you can just leave it in there the whole time and deal with the warnings and eliminate the warnings as you go through the function. It's kind of up to you, but you do have a debugger line here that you can add that tells it to stop warning you on everything because you know you declared it. You just haven't had time to get to the code that's actually using that variable yet. Now, I've also come in here. I think we already had the file library, and they call these crates. They don't call them libraries, and so every language calls them something different, but they're all the same thing. They're basically libraries that you're using with the application. But in Rust, they call them crates. So I'll try to refer to these as crates as we go forward. So I think we already had the crate in here for the file stuff and the get host name. I did add a buff read and a buff reader in here under the standard IO section. These crates are used to allow me to actually read one line at a time as I read through the file, and you'll see how this works in just a second. This is where we are collecting our arguments. I commented out the line that was printing that. I'm just going to get rid of it because I don't need it any longer. I did add this line in here, and what this is doing is it takes a look at this args variable that we have here, which we have collected the environment. So we've basically gone in and collected all the parameters that have been fed to this program through the command line. And we should have, if you look down here, we should have 3 arguments that come in. One of them is going to be the input, the output, and the hash that we're using to identify the user in the back-end system. Now, what I'm doing up here is I'm telling it that if we have less than 3 arguments, in other words, you run the application and don't provide me any arguments, then I would like for you to show this error message and return. Well, because we're in the main function, when we return, it actually exits the application. So it's not going to run. So in the case that we do this, we want to just exit out of the application. Now, one of the things, and at this point, you'll notice that we haven't actually done anything. We haven't even opened up our input file yet. So we're assuming at this point that we got called in error and we don't have enough information to operate on anyway. So we're getting out of here. At that point, we get our input, output, and hash files, just like we were doing earlier. We get our host name, which we had in here earlier. Here are a few of the differences. So earlier we were actually opening the file and reading all the contents into a string all at one time. Now what we're doing is we're actually telling the system to open the file, and we're using the input file, and we're unwrapping any errors or anything that we might have gotten when we go to open it, and we set that value to F. So F now is our file handle. You can think of it as a handle to that file. And when I say this unwrap, I'm not 100% sure on unwrap exactly what it's doing. I think it's related to the error handling, but I'm not 100% sure. So I've got to do a little bit more research on the unwrap. So I'll say something about that in a future video. And then this is actually defining a reader. And this is the buff reader that we're actually going to use to loop through the file. So this is like a buffer. So the earlier, say you had a 10,000 line file, the earlier code was taking the entire 10,000 lines and sticking it into a single string variable. This version is saying, I'm only going to read one line at a time. You got 10,000 lines, I'm going to read 10,000 times. And so it's going to loop and read one line at a time as it goes through that file. And so it's a buffer that we're actually writing into to look at. And so now we have a for loop here. So instead of just printing out S or whatever we had earlier in our code, now we're actually telling it to loop. And so we're saying for line. So this is going to be the variable that we're going to look at inside of this for loop. So we're going to say for line in reader dot lines. So it's going to, this, every time this executes, it's going to take the current line think of it as a pointer that's running down through this file saying, okay, I'm at this line, I'm at this line, I'm at this line. And every time you execute this reader dot lines, it moves to the next line and grabs the text off of it. And it sticks it inside of a variable called line. And so down here, I'm just going through and I start to look at things that are on the line. So in this particular instance, this interface that we're working on has version information in it. I'm not really concerned about the version information for what we're doing. And so we're just eating that. So we just tell it that, hey, if you see a line that happens to have the version 4.0 on it, just continue executing your loop. Don't worry about the version, just move on to the next line. And so that's going to bounce it right back up here. It's going to go down to the next line and it's going to get the data off of it. Typically you'd want to handle the version information, but in this particular instance, this file hasn't changed in many, many decades. So we just don't worry about it anymore. And so then the next thing it does is if it wasn't a version, then it looks to see if the line contains a $T with a P, which is a signal that the system is trying to push us an entire price file through this interface, which is something that we don't support in this particular situation. So we're killing that as well. So in the event that it sent us a TP, then we're just going to echo an error out that says that we don't support importing price files. We're going to drop. Now, we've already opened the input file. And as I said earlier, the way this interface works is the input file is created, we open it, we read it, and then once we're done creating the output file, we delete the input file, which releases the application that's calling us to go do whatever it wants to do. In this particular case, we want to drop our connection to that file. So we're basically closing F, which is our file handle. We're closing F, and then we turn around and we remove the file itself. So we're going to delete that input file, and we're doing that because that's the signal to the other application that it can continue and not wait on us. And so all this is doing is it goes out to remove the file. If it receives an okay, then everything's good. And then we return again, exit out of the application because we're done. And then this is just printing the current line for the moment so that for debugging purposes, eventually this line is actually going to get deleted out of here. So right now we have changed the way that we're actually opening this file. And so what we're about to start doing is, and we'll do it in the next video, what we're about to start doing is we're going to go through and start looping through each of the scenarios that we have to build up a line, a list of variables that we're going to build up that we're eventually going to send through as a JSON object to the back-end REST service that's actually going to receive this, process it, and then send us back the answer. So that's what we're going to be doing in the next video. We're going to go through and start this process of reading through this file and building up our string that we're going to use to pass off to the application when we're done.